The title of my talk today is called A Shot in the Arm, and it is based on an essay that I wrote actually last year, and today's talk is sort of an abbreviated version of that, and it might come across as maybe essayistic or didactic at times, but feel free to interrupt me at any point in order to maybe even start already a conversation. As an artist and researcher and occasional writer, I'm interested in, like Mario said, the politics of digitization, not only how they take shape technologically or on screen, but especially also how they travel, how they manifest materially, how they bleed into everyday life, how they influence off-screen life, if you will, and how they affect our surroundings, our subjectivities, our desires and modes of representation, how they actually come to change us and reorganize our visual culture at large. And these often unrepresentable, invisible, evasive yet pervasive logics of the digital are actually linked to what we would call maybe information or data. So what we're dealing with today is a sort of new kind of metric system of code that is becoming somehow the thriving engine of our technologically induced global social and economic order. And it is precisely here that I believe that any kind of politically informed or urgent critical thought of today must take shape in order to begin to understand somehow the technological conditions and challenges of the 21st century. And this is maybe a very serious topic, but so are games, right? Games are, I think, a serious business too, and we're here to discuss some of these issues. Since we're discussing games tonight, let me begin with confessing that I'm actually not really a particularly avid gamer myself. I've not really played a lot of video games, but it somehow increasingly becomes a terrain in which I find myself in through my work. Because if we think of video games as actions or as action-based mediums, since they require our participation, or in Derridian terms, as something that moves us forward, what you would call a movement of play, they become somehow a significant political domain to also give thought to. Okay, so let's start with a shot in the arm. To begin with, I would like to bring up one example and take you back to November 1971, when Chris Burden stood against the wall of a Californian art space, intentionally offering himself as a target to be shot. As part of his by now iconic performance titled Shoot, Burden's friend stood about 5 meters away from him, aiming a .22 rifle at his left arm, and only fired one bullet. And initially this bullet was only meant to nick Burden's arm, but instead it pierced through his arm and caused a blood-spattering wound. Now I'm sure that the majority of you know the piece that I'm referring to, but for those of you who might maybe not, this is a rendition of Shoot made in Second Life by the artist Scott Kendall, and that's more or less what the actual thing actually also looked like. So one could straightforwardly argue that what Burden did in this action at the time was a sort of a macho act of overweening ambition that served to somehow canonize his own career as a performance artist. But my point here today is not really about Chris, it is more about the burden that galvanized such an action to begin with. So regardless whether we judge this action by the scope of the canon or if we just see it through the crosshair of the actual gun aimed at him, the reason why I believe Shoot is worth picking up on and why I feel this action is somehow exemplary for our topic here today is because in many ways what Burden did was also a gamble with an unknown outcome, and we could also say that a gamble is in a way also very much a game. So Shoot as an action strikes some resemblances with something maybe seen in video games, but the big difference here is that it was very much real. It was serious business. Now, real life is said to be nothing like a game. We're taught that life is not a game because you only live once. In real life, there are no second chances. You don't get to start over again. At least this is what we're conditioned to believe. A game is also seen as enjoyment. It is different and distinct from work life, which is usually carried out for payment or remuneration. But today, however, these distinctions between everyday life and play are becoming somehow increasingly equivocal. The transfer of productivity from human labor to machines and code subsumes our bodies to all kinds of pervasive processes of datafication And that gives rise to a sort of new economy of capture in which things like self-optimization, performance are of principal value. So the media theorist Alexander Galloway goes as far to say that we're now actually living in a period of ludic capitalism. He calls it ludic capitalism, which is sort of a game economy whose online interfaces extract value from our continuous labor of play. And this phenomenon of the quantified self and gamification of life through softwares, apps and dashboards only seems to support this claim. In today's digital economy, our perception is somehow largely organized around the ubiquity of the game interface that comes in never-ending screens, moving images, targeted adverts, pop-ups, notifications, and so forth. But in the way that if games, like I said, if games let one act, then today's digital economy also requires our active participation to an almost incessant level. So reality itself is becoming more and more like a video game, only we don't really understand what we're actually fighting here. We seem to be completely clueless how to move forward, where to aim, or how to even prepare for a potential combat. Indeed, life might be informed by games, but the burden of actual reality still feels painfully real. Yeah, this is an example. Although this action from Burden took place 45 years ago, there's something disturbing but timelessly compelling behind the simplicity of such a wicked act. Burden's performance claimed to, at the time, be a materialization of widespread forms of violence which were mediated mostly through television, but it contained many elements of conventional shooter games as well. And for those of you who might know, most commonly the purpose of these shooter games is to shoot opponents and proceed through various missions without the actual player character being killed or dying. But Burden's performance reversed actually these logics by intentionally offering himself as the targets to be shot. So what Shoot did was actually to challenge the very understanding of the body as an ultimate real. Instead, it targeted the body as something that is replaceable, as something that might be repeatable, duplicable, as a sort of proxy or a stand-in. And in doing so, I think it imbued the real with a dimension of play through a gamble with his own mortality. So maybe it's in this avant-garde sense of the avant-garde 20th century art, maybe it never managed to break from reality, but what I think it did manage to do is to confuse reality by confronting it or superimposing it with its own violence. But more importantly, what I think it ultimately demonstrates is that in times of need, even the most unreasonable acts of play can be useful tools of deception, transgression, and maybe even subversion. But how can we relate maybe this example to some issues of today? Because it still feels somehow analog. The action feels analog in a sense that it enables communication from topos to topos. It still relies somehow on clearly defined, almost dialectical logics, as the case is with this example, because we have clearly defined parameters of sense of subjecthood. We know who the actual target is. We know who the agent or instigator is. But the digital paradigm codifies these notions of play. It translates them into a different space of numbers and logics of code that we are having to deal with today. So nowadays, giving oneself deliberately away as a target is no longer absurd, but has actually become quite normal. The state of proliferating digital technologies sees the body as a clear target, and static bodies, which are often glued to screens, are very easy targets. Bodies are somehow being seized by this ubiquity of visual stimulus everywhere, while the processual drive of our digital economy accumulates profits through through cognitive processes rather than through the force of actual physical labor. So these centralized digital economies are less and less dependent on the mobility and the productivity of bodies in the classic way, and more on our extensive fixations on visions and various notions of play. So we could even claim that we're being targeted by our very own economies that give rise to a sort of pernicious regime of ocular centrism. But moreover, if traditionally reality is largely understood and processed through vision, then digitization has also made it very hard to differentiate between original and fake. And the chase for high definition and resolution makes it also increasingly difficult for our eyes to trust what is real and what is not. Which also links back to images, because images in this system are no longer only powerful in what they want to represent, so in their sort of power of representation, but rather in the intensity of how they are being represented or produced and liked and shared and circulated. So images like video games today also require our active participation. They also need multiple players between which to be exchanged. And in fact, the very lifespan of an image is defined through and by participation. And also the success of its players is ranked and numbered in similar fashions through likes, friends, followers, shares, and so forth. So this is basically the main premise of the digital turnover, which is also described as a shift from representation, something that is seeable, to information, something that is not necessarily always seeable or accessible at first sight. So what we actually get to see on screens is only a mathematical conversion of data into something visual by means of the interface, when the actual informational aspects that constitute them remain largely invisible to us. So this is something that I'm very interested in, because these underlying codes form all kinds of actually complex informational landscapes that extend, of course, beyond our direct perception and recognition, as is the case with algorithms that points to a whole new level of abstraction beyond what the user necessarily sees on the screen. So it's a very sort of contradictory double bind, where on the one hand we're dealing with an abundance of visual material that's collectively generate, but the actual technological power structures that enable it and make it profitable remain largely invisible. I think today's advanced capitalism occupies this very strongly, like this aesthetic domain that is sustained by it and that also becomes it. And this is where I'd have to have a serious conversation with myself, or we as artists and practitioners in the field of art. So I will put on my artist hat on now and speak a bit from this position. That I think that any kind of sort of qualitative shift in perspective or proposition or opposition from the field of art, and this depends a bit what you understand as art, but if we can agree that it is some sort of formatting of intensities that engenders some kind of potential for change, to think differently, to act differently, it becomes very hard to do so with aesthetic means. And this is why I think that this is why I find myself more talking in art institutions and galleries like today than actually showing work, because I think we need to sort of focus on re-articulating things and finding a different approach in recognizing these elements of digitization in our material surrounding. But what I want to continue with this new digital space. So what are we actually dealing with exactly? And in order to do so, I will come back to my first example, but jump a bit forward in time. So we have a very similar situation here. It's basically the same, but only our hero looks way cooler, and this time he actually is not shot, but he manages to dodge the bullet. And this is a scene I'm probably sure that most of you know. It's from The Matrix, and it's particularly interesting because from a cinematic point of view, because it introduces an element of so-called gamic cinema. So the point where digital aesthetics of gaming actually penetrate and influence the spatiotemporal sequence of the film. It represents also sort of a breach from the traditional linear temporal perspective of cinema that relies on montage techniques and introduces a new element that is actually a gamic space. Here the subjective camera doesn't just look at the scene, but kind of becomes the scene. It moves actively through the space. It creates a new dimension and introduces a spatial element to seeing that is also known as bullet time. It's referred most commonly as bullet time. Moreover, it also shatters clearly defined parameters of subjecthood, like maybe in the example of Chris Burden, because the bullet kind of becomes the subject, so it penetrates this whole scene. But bullet time is actually a technique that is taken from video games. It is also much easier to simulate virtually than actually do in cinema.
It was first introduced in our screen.
Yeah. Please, do you want to? Yeah, bullet time is actually a technique taken also from video games, and is also much easier to simulate virtually than it is to actually capture with the camera, because bullet time requires a fully rendered sense of space, an actionable space that can be explorable without montage techniques at all times, like is the case in many video games. So the actual game space is rendered and ready, but only becomes actively perceptible once the player moves on. So it requires somehow kind of movement of the player. And bullet time is actually more about space than it is about light, and it has the luxury to exist outside of this optical time. It's a gamic vision. It exists, but it also doesn't exist. It's perceptible, but it's also not. It's rendered, but it's rendered invisible. And I think it's interesting if we would link this element to perhaps what Mackenzie work would understand as game space. A sum total of virtuality, a digital and algorithmic space that is always somehow there, but never really showing. It's always somehow there, but we never get to see it because we do not know what happens between a machine and a machine. But what I find more intriguing is another interpretation of a media theorist called Espen Arset, who calls these types of underlying digital topologies cybertexts. So he refers to the space as a textual space, as a mathematical system of language and code. And he says that to actually navigate these texts requires a mode of engagement that is far more complex than sender-receiver model, which is to say any sort of oppositional binary logics of cause and effect. As he continues to highlight, he says that the cybertext reader is a player, he or she is a gambler, and the cybertext is a game world or a world game, and it is possible to explore and get lost and discover secret paths in these texts, not only metaphorically, but actually through the topical structure of their textual machinery, which I find very interesting. But how could we approach this on a practical level? From the sound of it, one would assume that through such forms of engagement, we would already have reached reconfigurations of time and space, and for all we know, our life could be life on respawn, not one of Second Life. But instead what we have is Pokemon Go and face swap. Bullets, they still kill, and bodies that are in jeopardy are forced to stay put, while those labeled undesirable are threatened with deportation, as is the case with a lot of with the refugee crisis of today. Financial markets still enjoy unbridled movement, and actual space and time have not really moved forward much beyond FaceTime. So the type of game that we are playing today seems neither to be entirely material nor virtual. It is not so much of a swap as a superimposition of a virtuality on a materiality that is still heavily laced with traces of the human. Just to give you an example, there were like a lot of these articles of Pokemon Go players who were really into their game but would be arriving to obscure destinations like minefields in Bosnia, like Fukushima, radioactive spaces, Holocaust in memorials in Germany. So if video games are actions, then the only action that we actually seem to be getting is one that roots us back to the Drarian hordes of our very, very own past. The real virtual, however, of today is money and markets. They're invisible, they're inconspicuous, they're insidious, but they're real, just like climate change. The financial markets are your artificial intelligence. They are an AI, and they get to play while we participate. They govern while we perform. They pose demands while we strike all the deals. And in such nauseating states of permanent performance, how could we think of strategies to play differently? So this gamification of life is not only evident on screen, it also reaches out into various aspects of life. Consider, for example, the way that economies are replaced with monopolies. Look at how democracies today are being reduced to a game of strategic chess play, how incompetent leaders bluff their way to the top. So we are living in societies and economies that are defined by a global competitive drive for victory and profit, where reason, logics, and playing by the rules don't really apply. So somewhere between, this is gaming terminology, respawn and permadeath. Respawn is the ability for a character to continuously come back in life. Permadeath is an absolute death. Somewhere between these two notions, what we have as a society, as a global society, seem to be what we have seem to have reached is could best be described as a state of stasis, no movement, both in terms of literal standstill and also in Giorgio Agamben's terms as a political paradigm of inexhaustible planetary war and a futureless future. So the world might be moving faster than we can keep up with, but we are somehow stuck. To sum it up, we might already be targeted by our very own systems, paralyzed by our technologies, or blinded by our sense of representation, and let down by leaders. But how to combat the idea that there is truly no alternative? So for me, one game comes to mind that certain mammals, some fish and humankind in particular, have always been exceptional at. If everything else fails, you can close your eyes and just pretend you're dead, play you're dead. And it's likely the oldest game to ever have existed, but in all its banality, it could now be more relevant than ever before. And how? Well, I think there's a small but a very decisively real difference between being a zombie and playing dead, and it has to do with agency. There's a certain kind of agency still involved. It is a small difference that is maybe comparable to the difference between work and twerk, between a whistle and a blow, between a hack and a rip, between a strike and a pose, between a shoot and a share, between survival and staying alive, ultimately. So pick it up and let yourself be guided by it, activate it, and try to play it through. If you cannot move, float. If destroy but don't destruct. Leak but never bleed. Encrypt and don't exclaim. Confuse but don't cheat. Remix but don't rip off. These are really slight nuances that make a huge difference. Play dead but don't actually be dead inside. Practice this, stop before it turns fatal, and let us play. Try to play freely. Let us play madly, foolishly, convincingly, and above all, differently. But there is, however, one last requirement. In a world of misleading, permeating, and flawed forms of representation, we cannot rely on vision to inform us what is real. I think if we want to really play differently today, we will have to learn to do so with our eyes closed. Thank you.